Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the post-Roman Republic period of the ancient Roman civilization, characterized by government headed by emperors, and large territorial holdings around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, Africa and Asia. The city of Rome was the largest city in the world BC, with Constantinople becoming the largest around AD 500, and the empire's populace grew to an estimated 50 to 90 million inhabitants. The 500-year-old republic which preceded it was severely destabilized in a series of civil wars and political conflict, during which Julius Caesar was appointed as perpetual dictator, and then assassinated in 44 BC. Civil wars and executions continued, culminating in the victory of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and the annexation of Egypt. Octavian's power was then unassailable, and in 27 BC the Roman Senate formally granted him overarching power and the new title Augustus, effectively marking the end of the Roman Republic. The imperial period of Rome lasted approximately 1,500 years compared to the 500 years of the Republican era. The first 2 centuries of the empire's existence were a period of unprecedented political stability and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Following Octavian's victory, the size of the empire was dramatically increased. After the assassination of Caligula in AD 41, the Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Claudius emperor instead. Under Claudius, the empire invaded Britannia, its first major expansion since Augustus. After Claudius's successor, Nero, committed suicide in AD 68, the empire suffered a series of brief civil wars, as well as a concurrent major rebellion in Judea, during which 4 different legionary generals were proclaimed emperor. Vespasian emerged triumphant in AD 69, establishing the Flavian dynasty, before being succeeded by his son Titus, who opened the Colosseum shortly after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. His short reign was followed by the long reign of his brother Domitian, who was eventually assassinated. The Senate then appointed the first of the 5 good emperors. The empire reached its greatest extent under Trajan, the second in this line. A period of increasing trouble and decline began with the reign of Commodus. Commodus's assassination in 192 triggered the year of the 5 emperors, of which Septimius Severus emerged victorious. The assassination of Alexander Severus in 235 led to the crisis of the 3rd century, in which 26 men were declared emperor by the Roman Senate over a 50-year time span. It was not until the reign of Diocletian that the empire was fully stabilized, with the introduction of the Tetrarchy, which saw 4 emperors ruled the empire at once. This arrangement was ultimately unsuccessful, leading to a civil war that was finally ended by Constantine I, who defeated his rivals and became the sole ruler of the empire. Constantine subsequently shifted the capital to Byzantium, which was renamed Constantinople in his honor. It remained the capital of the East until its demise. Constantine also adopted Christianity, which later became the official state religion of the empire. This eastern part of the empire remained one of the leading powers in the world alongside its arch-rival, the Sassanid Empire, which had inherited a centuries-old Roman-Persian conflict from its predecessor the Parthians. Following the death of Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule a united Roman Empire, the dominion of the empire was gradually eroded by abuses of power, civil wars, barbarian migrations and invasions, military reforms, and economic depression. The sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths and again in 455 by the Vandals accelerated the Western Empire's decay, while the deposition of the Emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 by Odoacer is generally accepted to mark the end of the empire in the West. However, Augustulus was never recognized by his eastern colleague, and separate rule in the western part of the empire only ceased to exist upon the death of Julius Nepos in 480. The Eastern Roman Empire endured for another millennium, eventually falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Roman Empire was among the most powerful economic, cultural, political, and military forces in the world of its time. It was one of the largest empires in world history. At its height under Trajan, it covered 5 million square kilometers. It held sway over an estimated 70 million people, at that time 21% of the world's entire population. The longevity and vast extent of the empire ensured the lasting influence of Latin and Greek language, culture, religion, inventions, architecture, philosophy, law, and forms of government on the empire's descendants. Throughout the European medieval period, attempts were even made to establish successors to the Roman Empire, including the Empire of Romania, a Crusader state, and the Holy Roman Empire, by means of European colonialism following the Renaissance, and their descendant states. Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian culture was exported on a worldwide scale, playing a crucial role in the development of the modern world. History. Rome had begun expanding shortly after the founding of the Republic in the 6th century BC, though it did not expand outside the Italian peninsula until the 3rd century BC. Then, it was an empire, long before it had an emperor. The Roman Republic was not a nation-state in the modern sense, but a network of towns left to rule themselves and provinces administered by military commanders. It was ruled, not by emperors, but by annually elected magistrates in conjunction with the Senate. For various reasons, the 1st century BC was a time of political and military upheaval, which ultimately led to rule by emperors. The consul's military power rested in the Roman legal concept of imperium, which literally means command. Occasionally, successful consuls were given the honorary title imperator, and this is the origin of the word emperor, since this title was always bestowed to the early emperors upon their accession. Rome suffered a long series of internal conflicts, conspiracies and civil wars from the late 2nd century BC onwards, while greatly extending its power beyond Italy. This was the period of the crisis of the Roman Republic. Towards the end of this era, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was briefly perpetual dictator before being assassinated. The faction of his assassins was driven from Rome and defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC by an army led by Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian. Antony and Octavian's division of the Roman world between themselves did not last, and Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. In 27 BC, the Senate and people of Rome made Octavian princeps with proconsular imperium, thus beginning the Principate, and gave him the name of Augustus. Though the old constitutional machinery remained in place, Augustus came to predominate it. Although the Republic stood in name, contemporaries of Augustus knew it was just a veil, and that Augustus had all meaningful authority in Rome. Since his rule ended a century of civil wars and began an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity, he was so loved that he came to hold the power of a monarch de facto if not de jure. During the years of his rule, A new constitutional order emerged, so that, upon his death, this new constitutional order operated as before when Tiberius was accepted as the new emperor. The 200 years that began with Augustus' rule is traditionally regarded as the Pax Romana. During this period, the cohesion of the empire was furthered by a degree of social stability and economic prosperity that Rome had never before experienced. Uprisings in the provinces were infrequent, but put down mercilessly and swiftly when they occurred. The 60 years of Jewish-Roman wars in the second half of the 1st century and the first half of the 2nd century were exceptional in their duration and violence. The success of Augustus in establishing principles of dynastic succession was limited by his outliving a number of talented potential heirs. The Julio-Claudian dynasty lasted for 4 more emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius and Nero, before it yielded in 69 AD to the strife-torn year of 4 emperors, from which Vespasian emerged as victor. Vespasian became the founder of the brief Flavian dynasty, to be followed by the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, which produced the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius and the philosophically inclined Marcus Aurelius. In the view of the Greek historian Dio Cassius, a contemporary observer, the accession of the Emperor Commodus in 180 AD marked the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron, a famous comment which has led some historians, notably Edward Gibbon, to take Commodus's reign as the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. In 212, during the reign of Caracalla, Roman citizenship was granted to all freeborn inhabitants of the empire. But despite this gesture of universality, the Severan dynasty was tumultuous. An emperor's reign was ended routinely by his murder or execution, and, following its collapse, the Roman Empire was engulfed by the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of invasions, civil strife, economic disorder, and plague. In defining historical epochs, this crisis is sometimes viewed as marking the transition from classical antiquity to late antiquity. Aurelian brought the empire back from the brink and stabilized it. Diocletian completed the work of fully restoring the empire, but declined the role of princeps, and became the first emperor to be addressed regularly as domini, master or lord. This marked the end of the Principate, and the beginning of the Dominate. Diocletian's reign also brought the empire's most concerted effort against the perceived threat of Christianity, the Great Persecution. The state of absolute monarchy that began with Diocletian endured until the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453. Diocletian divided the empire into 4 regions, each ruled by a separate emperor, the Tetrarchy. Confident that he fixed the disorders that were plaguing Rome, he abdicated along with his co-emperor, and the Tetrarchy soon collapsed. Order was eventually restored by Constantine the Great, who became the first emperor to convert to Christianity, and who established Constantinople as the new capital of the Eastern Empire. During the decades of the Constantinian and Valentinian dynasties, the empire was divided along an east-west axis, with dual power centers in Constantinople and Rome. The reign of Julian, who attempted to restore classical Roman and Hellenistic religion, only briefly interrupted the succession of Christian emperors. Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule over both East and West, died in 395 AD after making Christianity the official religion of the empire. The Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate in the early 5th century as Germanic migrations and invasions overwhelmed the capacity of the empire to assimilate the migrants and fight off the invaders. The Romans were successful in fighting off all invaders. most famously Attila, though the empire had assimilated so many Germanic peoples of dubious loyalty to Rome that the empire started to dismember itself. Most chronologies place the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476, when Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate to the Germanic warlord Odoacer, by placing himself under the rule of the Eastern Emperor, rather than naming himself emperor. Odoacer ended the Western Empire by ending the line of Western emperors. The empire in the East, often known as the Byzantine Empire, but referred to in its time as the Roman Empire or by various other names, had a different fate. It survived for almost a millennium after the fall of its Western counterpart, and became the most stable Christian realm during the Middle Ages. During the 6th century, Justinian I reconquered northern Africa and Italy. But within a few years of Justinian's death, Byzantine possessions in Italy were greatly reduced by the Lombards who settled in the peninsula in the east, partially resulting from the destructive plague of Justinian. The Romans were threatened by the rise of Islam, whose followers rapidly conquered the territories of Syria, Armenia, and Egypt during the Byzantine-Arab Wars, and soon presented a direct threat to Constantinople. In the following century, the Arabs also captured southern Italy and Sicily. Slavic populations were also able to penetrate deep into the Balkans. The Romans, however, managed to stop further Islamic expansion into their lands during the 8th century and, beginning in the 9th century, reclaimed parts of the conquered lands. In 1000 AD, the Eastern Empire was at its height. Basil II reconquered Bulgaria and Armenia. Culture and trade flourished. However, soon after, the expansion was abruptly stopped in 1071, with the Byzantine defeat in the Battle of Manzikert. The aftermath of this important battle sent the empire into a protracted period of decline. 2 decades of internal strife and Turkic invasions ultimately paved the way for Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to send a call for help to the Western European kingdoms in 1095. The West responded with the Crusades, eventually resulting in the sack of Constantinople by participants in the Fourth Crusade. The conquest of Constantinople in 1204 fragmented what remained of the empire into successor states, the ultimate victor being that of Nicaea. After the recapture of Constantinople by imperial forces, the empire was little more than a Greek state confined to the Aegean coast. The Roman Empire finally collapsed when Mehmed the Conqueror conquered Constantinople on 29 May 1453. Geography and demography. The Roman Empire was one of the largest in history, with contiguous territories throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Latin phrase imperium sine fine expressed the ideology that neither time nor space limited the empire. In Virgil's epic poem The Aeneid, limitless empire is said to be granted to the Romans by their supreme deity Jupiter. This claim of universal dominion was renewed and perpetuated when the empire came under Christian rule in the 4th century. In reality, Roman expansion was mostly accomplished under the Republic, though parts of northern Europe were conquered in the 1st century AD. When Roman control in Europe, Africa and Asia was strengthened during the reign of Augustus. A global map of the known world was displayed for the first time in public at Rome, coinciding with the composition of the most comprehensive work on political geography that survives from antiquity, the geography of the Pontic Greek writer Strabo. When Augustus died, the commemorative account of his achievements prominently featured the geographical cataloguing of peoples and places within the empire. Geography, the census, and the meticulous keeping of written records were central concerns of Roman imperial administration. The empire reached its largest expanse under Trajan, encompassing an area of 5 million square kilometers. The traditional population estimate of inhabitants accounted for between 1/6 and 1/4 of the world's total population, and made it the largest population of any unified political entity in the West until the mid-19th century. Recent demographic studies have argued for a population peak ranging from to more than each of the three largest cities in the empire, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, was almost twice the size of any European city at the beginning of the 17th century. As the historian Christopher Kelly has described it, Trajan's successor Hadrian adopted a policy of maintaining rather than expanding the empire. Borders were marked, and the frontiers patrolled. The most heavily fortified borders were the most unstable. Hadrian's Wall, which separated the Roman world from what was perceived as an ever-present barbarian threat, is the primary surviving monument of this effort. Languages. The language of the Romans was Latin, which Virgil emphasizes as a source of Roman unity and tradition. Until the time of Alexander Severus, the birth certificates and wills of Roman citizens had to be written in Latin. Latin was the language of the law courts in the West and of the military throughout the empire, but was not imposed officially on peoples brought under Roman rule. This policy contrasts with that of Alexander the Great, who aimed to impose Greek throughout his empire as the official language. As a consequence of Alexander's conquests, Con-Greek had become the shared language around the eastern Mediterranean and into Asia Minor. The linguistic frontier, dividing the Latin West and the Greek East, passed through the Balkan Peninsula. Romans who received an elite education studied Greek as a literary language, and most men of the governing classes could speak Greek. The Julio-Claudian emperors encouraged high standards of correct Latin, a linguistic movement identified in modern terms as Classical Latin, and favored Latin for conducting official business. Claudius tried to limit the use of Greek, and on occasion revoked the citizenship of those who lacked Latin. But even in the Senate, he drew on his own bilingualism in communicating with Greek-speaking ambassadors. Suetonius quotes him as referring to our two languages. In the Eastern Empire, laws and official documents were regularly translated into Greek from Latin. The everyday interpenetration of the two languages is indicated by bilingual inscriptions, which sometimes even switch back and forth between Greek and Latin. After all, freeborn inhabitants of the empire were universally enfranchised in 212 AD. A great number of Roman citizens would have lacked Latin, though they were expected to acquire at least a token knowledge, and Latin remained a marker of Romanness. Among other reforms, the Emperor Diocletian sought to renew the authority of Latin, and the Greek expression he kratos dialectis attests to the continuing status of Latin as the language of power. In the early 6th century, the Emperor Justinian engaged in a quixotic effort to reassert the status of Latin as the language of law, even though in his time Latin no longer held any currency as a living language in the East. Local languages and linguistic legacy. References to interpreters indicate the continuing use of local languages other than Greek and Latin, particularly in Egypt, where Coptic predominated, and in military settings along the Rhine and Danube. Roman jurists also show a concern for local languages such as Punic, Gaulish, and Aramaic in assuring the correct understanding and application of laws and oaths. In the province of Africa, Libyco-Berber, and Punic were used in inscriptions and for legends on coins during the time of Tiberius. Libico-Berber and Punic inscriptions appear on public buildings into the 2nd century. Some bilingual with Latin. In Syria, Palmyrene soldiers even used their dialect of Aramaic for inscriptions, in a striking exception to the rule that Latin was the language of the military. The Bab Aether archive is a suggestive example of multilingualism in the empire. These papyri, named for a Jewish woman in the province of Arabia and dating from 93 to 132 AD, mostly employ Aramaic, the local language, written in Greek characters with Semitic and Latin influences. A petition to the Roman governor, however, was written in Greek. The dominance of Latin among the literate elite may obscure the continuity of spoken languages, since all cultures within the Roman Empire were predominantly oral. In the West, Latin, referred to in its spoken form as Vulgar Latin, gradually replaced Celtic and Italic languages that were related to it by a shared Indo-European origin. Commonalities in syntax and vocabulary facilitated the adoption of Latin. After the decentralization of political power in late antiquity, Latin developed locally into branches that became the Romance languages, such as Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian and Romanian, and a large number of minor languages and dialects. Today, more than 900 million people are native speakers worldwide. As an international language of learning and literature, Latin itself continued as an active medium of expression for diplomacy and for intellectual developments identified with Renaissance humanism up to the 17th century, and for law in the Roman Catholic Church to the present. Although Greek continued as the language of the Byzantine Empire, linguistic distribution in the East was more complex. A Greek-speaking majority lived in the Greek peninsula and islands, western Anatolia, major cities, and some coastal areas. Like Greek and Latin, the Thracian language was of Indo-European origin, as were several now extinct languages in Anatolia attested by imperial-era inscriptions. Albanian is often seen as the descendant of Illyrian, although this hypothesis has been challenged by some linguists, who maintain that it derives from Dacian or Thracian. Various Afro-Asiatic languages, primarily Coptic in Egypt, and Aramaic in Syria and Mesopotamia, were never replaced by Greek. The international use of Greek, however, was one factor enabling the spread of Christianity, as indicated for example by the use of Greek for the epistles of Paul. Society. The Roman Empire was remarkably multicultural, with a rather astonishing cohesive capacity to create a sense of shared identity while encompassing diverse peoples within its political system. Over a long span of time, the Roman attention to creating public monuments and communal spaces open to all, such as forums, amphitheaters, racetracks, and baths, helped foster a sense of Romanness. Roman society had multiple, overlapping, social hierarchies that modern concepts of class in English may not represent accurately. The 2 decades of civil war from which Augustus rose to sole power left traditional society in Rome in a state of confusion and upheaval, but did not affect an immediate redistribution of wealth and social power. From the perspective of the lower classes, a peak was merely added to the social pyramid. Personal relationships, patronage, friendship, family, marriage, continued to influence the workings of politics and government, as they had in the Republic. By the time of Nero, however, it was not unusual to find a former slave who was richer than a freeborn citizen, or an equestrian who exercised greater power than a senator. The blurring and diffusion of the Republic's more rigid hierarchies led to increased social mobility under the empire, both upward and downward, to an extent that exceeded that of all other well-documented ancient societies. Women, freedmen, and slaves had opportunities to profit and exercise influence in ways previously less available to them. Social life in the empire, particularly for those whose personal resources were limited, was further fostered by a proliferation of voluntary associations and confraternities formed for various purposes: profession and trade guilds, veterans groups, religious sodalities, drinking and dining clubs, performing arts troupes, and burial societies. Infanticide has been recorded in the Roman Empire and may have been widespread. Legal status. According to the jurist Gaius, the essential distinction in the Roman law of persons was that all human beings were either free or slaves. The legal status of free persons might be further defined by their citizenship. Most citizens held limited rights, but were entitled to legal protections and privileges not enjoyed by those who lacked citizenship. Free people not considered citizens, but living within the Roman world, held status as peregrini, non-Romans. In 212 AD, by means of the edict known as the Constitutio Antoniniana, the Emperor Caracalla extended citizenship to all freeborn inhabitants of the empire. This legal egalitarianism would have required a far-reaching revision of existing laws that had distinguished between citizens and non-citizens. Women in Roman law. Freeborn Roman women were considered citizens throughout the Republican Empire, but did not vote, hold political office, or serve in the military. A mother's citizen status determined that of her children, as indicated by the phrase ex duobus civibus Romanis natos. A Roman woman kept her own family name for life. Children most often took the father's name, but in the imperial period sometimes made their mother's name part of theirs, or even used it instead. The archaic form of manus marriage, in which the woman had been subject to her husband's authority, was largely abandoned by the imperial era, and a married woman retained ownership of any property she brought into the marriage. Technically she remained under her father's legal authority, even though she moved into her husband's home, but when her father died she became legally emancipated. This arrangement was one of the factors in the degree of independence Roman women enjoyed relative to those of many other ancient cultures and up to the modern period. Although she had to answer to her father in legal matters, she was free of his direct scrutiny in her daily life, and her husband had no legal power over her. Although it was a point of pride to be a one-man woman who had married only once, there was little stigma attached to divorce, nor to speedy remarriage after the loss of a husband through death or divorce. Girls had equal inheritance rights with boys if their father died without leaving a will. A Roman mother's right to own property and to dispose of it as she saw fit, including setting the terms of her own will, gave her enormous influence over her sons even when they were adults. As part of the Augustan program to restore traditional morality and social order, moral legislation attempted to regulate the conducts of men and women as a means of promoting family values. Adultery, which had been a private family matter under the Republic, was criminalized and defined broadly as an illicit sex act that occurred between a male citizen and a married woman, or between a married woman and any man other than her husband. Childbearing was encouraged by the state. A woman who had given birth to 3 children was granted symbolic honors and greater legal freedom because of their legal status as citizens and the degree to which they could become emancipated. Women could own property, enter contracts, and engage in business, including shipping, manufacturing, and lending money. Inscriptions throughout the empire honor women as benefactors in funding public works, an indication they could acquire and dispose of considerable fortunes. For instance, the Arch of the Sergi was funded by Salvia Postuma, a female member of the family honored, and the largest building in the Forum at Pompeii was funded by Eumachia, a priestess of Venus. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.